The velvet case snapped open, and the room stopped breathing. Dante Veyron stood at the head of the long table, 43 years old, silver at his temples, a jaw cut from something harder than stone, and in his hands sat the crown of Veyron, emerald and gold, old as sin. Every eye in the room locked onto it. Everyone knew what it meant. Everyone knew who it was supposed to go to. Seraphina stood at the far end of the table, 8 months pregnant, one hand resting against her stomach, like a woman who had learned long ago not to reach for things she couldn't be certain of. She watched her husband. She did not move. She did not speak. Dante turned away from her. He walked toward Vivian Cross, who was seated 3 chairs to his left, wearing a dress the color of red wine, and he placed the crown of Veyron on her head, like it had always belonged there. The silence that followed was not shocked. It was the silence of people who understood exactly what they had just witnessed and were deciding, very carefully, whether to breathe. Seraphina looked at the crown on another woman's head. Then she looked at her husband's face. Then she reached down, removed her wedding ring, and set beside her untouched wineglass without a sound. "You just crowned the wrong woman," she said. Not loud, not broken. The way you'd tell a man the building behind him was on fire. If you've ever been made to feel invisible, that someone who is supposed to see you stay. Because this story is about what happens when that woman finally decides to be seen. Before we go further, if you're new here, hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a story like this one. Drop a like and leave a comment with the city and country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's go back to the beginning, because to understand what Seraphina did next, you need to understand everything she had already done. The Veyron estate sat on the northern edge of Chicago, like a dark crown itself black, iron gates, white stone columns, windows that reflected sky but gave nothing back. It had stood for 3 generations. 3 generations of men who built power through fear, through blood, through deals made in rooms where the lights were never fully on. Seraphina Calloway had married into it 9 years ago, at 26 years old. She was the daughter of a mid-level accountant who had worked for the Veyron family's legitimate businesses for 15 years. She was not beautiful in the way that stopped her. She was precise. Precise features, precise posture. The kind of woman who listened to everything and repeated almost nothing, which most men in Dante's world mistook for compliance. Dante had chosen her for 3 reasons: her father's loyalty, her own visible quietness, and the fact that she did not seem to want anything from him. He had been wrong about that last part from the very first night. She had wanted everything. She had simply learned, very early, that the fastest way to get it was to never let anyone see you reaching. The first years of the marriage were not brutal. They were worse than that. They were indifferent. Dante was running an empire that had been handed to him at 31 by his dying father, and an empire like the Veyrons required a specific kind of attention, the kind that left very little room for a wife who sat quietly at dinner and asked careful questions about the shipping accounts. He had other women. He didn't hide them well. He simply didn't believe Seraphina cared enough to notice, and if she did notice, he believed she cared too much about her own comfort to say anything. Both assumptions were incorrect. What Dante didn't understand, what almost no one understood, was that Seraphina had spent those first 3 years doing something very methodical. She had been learning the empire, not the surface of it, not the legitimate restaurant chains and the real estate holdings and the import companies with clean books. She had been learning the machinery underneath, the actual machinery, suppliers who didn't want their names on paper, the judges who needed favors packaged as campaign donations, the logistics network that moved certain things across state lines in refrigerated trucks, the accountant in Milwaukee who kept 2 sets of books, the banker in Geneva who asked no questions. She learned all of it, not by demanding access, not by confronting Dante, or positioning herself as his equal in those early years that would have been wrong. She learned it the way water learns a stone, by being present, by being patient, by being so unobtrusive that people stopped remembering she was in the room when they said things they shouldn't have said. Dante's most trusted captain, a man named Ferris Colt, who had a habit of arriving early to meetings and drinking 2 cups of coffee before anyone else arrived, talked too much when he was comfortable. Seraphina became comfortable furniture to him. Within 18 months, she knew the full structure of every active operation in the family. Within 3 years, she had begun building her own structure alongside it, quietly, invisible, the way a second skeleton grows inside the first. Called it nothing at the time. She had no name for what she was doing, because naming it would have required admitting to herself what she already knew, that her husband's empire was built on a foundation of arrogance, and arrogance was the fastest crack in any foundation she had ever seen. She was simply preparing. She was simply protecting herself, and, later, the child she now carried. Vivienne Cross had appeared in Dante's life 14 months before the night of the crown. She was 31 years old, the daughter of a minor Chicago developer who had done work for the Veyron family twice in the past decade. She was visibly striking, the kind of woman who understood the effect she produced and used it with the efficiencies of someone who had learned early that efficiency was the only real currency available to her. She was not stupid. Seraphina had never made the mistake of believing that, but she was being used. Seraphina had known it for 11 of those 14 months. She had watched the pattern emerge with the detachment of someone watching weather form. Vivienne's access to Dante had expanded too quickly. The gifts moved in one direction, always from Vivienne to Dante. Small things, nothing that would raise alarms, but calibrated with a precision that didn't belong to a woman falling in love, belonged to someone running an operation. Seraphina had waited. She had gathered. She had let it continue, because stopping it too early would have been like pulling a thread, before you knew how far it ran. She knew by the time Dante announced the evening gathering at the estate that the thread ran all the way to the Moretti family, the Veyron's most dangerous competitors, who operated out of the south side and had been quietly attempting to dismantle the Veyron Empire's upper structure for the better part of 2 years. She had evidence. She had names, dates, account transfers. She had a recording made through a contact she had cultivated inside a hotel where Vivienne met her actual handlers, of a conversation that would have ended Vivienne's position in Dante's world within the first 30 seconds of playing it. She had not played it. She had held it. Because the moment she played it, people would ask how she had it. And the moment they asked, that they would begin to understand exactly how much of this empire she had been quietly running from inside. She had not been ready for that conversation yet. Then Dante opened the velvet case and placed the crown on Vivienne's head, and Seraphina looked at the room, at the captains, at the family, faces cycling through shock and calculation and something approaching relief that it wasn't them in the middle of this. And she made a decision. She was ready now. The ring made a small, clean sound against the wine glass. Dante looked at it. Then he looked at Seraphina's face, and something moved behind his eyes that he would not have named if asked, because naming it would have required him to examine it. And Dante Veyron had spent 43 years building a life in which examination was someone else's job. Seraphina. His voice was the voice he used to end conversations. "Don't need to explain it," she said. She was already removing the chair from the table, not urgently, the way someone tidies before they leave, rather than because they've lost. "You've been explaining it for 9 years without using words. Tonight you simply ran out of patience for the effort." Vivienne's hand moved to the crown on her head, a small instinctive gesture, checking that it was still there. It was the gesture of someone who had not expected to receive something and wasn't sure yet whether to trust it. Dante's uncle Cassian sat 3 seats to the right, silver-haired and still, a man who had been second in the Veyron family structure for 15 years. With the controlled stillness of someone who had long ago accepted that second was his position. He watched Seraphina with an expression that was almost careful. Almost. She caught it. She filed it. "Where are you going?" Dante said. "To get some sleep." She picked up her water glass instead of the wine. She had not touched the wine all evening, had not touched it for 8 months, and took a sip. "The baby is restless tonight. We're not done." "You're right," she said. "We're not." She looked at him directly, not with anger. Anger was a signal, and signals told people where your edges were. She looked at him the way she had looked at him on their wedding night, when she had first understood clearly who he was and what she was working with. "This particular conversation will be different than the one you think you're about to have. And I don't think tonight is the right moment for it. Not with everyone watching." She meant it as information, not as concession. The difference was one she understood precisely. She was not sure he did. Vivienne said Dante, in a voice that was calibrated to sound like concern and landed somewhere short of it. Seraphina did not look at her. That also was intentional. She walked out of the dining room with her back straight and the ring still on the table. The room exhaled. Ferris Colt, who had known Seraphina long enough to have stopped seeing her, looked at the empty doorway for 3 seconds longer than he looked at anything else. Beside him, a younger captain named Reeves, 28 years old and still naive enough to be surprised by things, leaned slightly forward. "That was it," he murmured. "She just left?" "She just left," Ferris said, and the tone of it, flatter than he'd intended, drew a look from Cassian that they both pretended not to notice. Dante set the velvet case on the table and sat down. He reached for his drink. His jaw was tight, the specific tightness of a man who expected resistance and received something worse. Capitulation, or what looked like capitulation. He was not yet sure which it was, and the uncertainty annoyed him more than argument would have. Vivienne touched his arm. "She'll come around," she said. "People do." He looked at the rings aside the wineglass and said nothing. Seraphina did not go to the room she shared with Dante. She went instead to the small study at the far end of the east wing. The room everyone assumed was used for personal correspondence, which it was, among other things. Closed the door, stood at the center of the room for a moment, and pressed both hands flat against the desk. Baby moved, a full rolling movement that pushed against her ribs. "I know," she said quietly. "I know." She sat down. She opened the bottom drawer of the desk with a key she kept on a chain that had never left her body in 4 years. Inside the drawer, beneath a folder of legitimately boring correspondence, was a smaller folder. Inside that, a list of 17 names with corresponding contact information, a burner phone, and a small notebook in her own handwriting, page after page of dates, amounts, routing numbers, initials. She did not open any of it tonight. Tonight, she simply looked at it. She had the strange, specific feeling of a woman who has spent years building toward a moment, and now that the moment has arrived, finds herself not exhilarated but very, very calm. Like a surgeon who has rehearsed a procedure so many times that the actual performance feels almost retrospective. Picked up the burner phone. She typed 3 words to a contact listed in the notebook as G, L and sent them, "Prepare the accounts." She put the phone back. She pulled out a different folder, this one from the back of the drawer, and opened it to a document she had read 40 times. The Veyron succession bylaws, drafted by Dante's grandfather in 1961, and never formally revised. She read the relevant paragraph again, though she had long since memorized it. In the event that the sitting head of the Veyron family is removed from power, deceased, or formally stripped of authority by a majority of the senior council, succession passes to the eldest surviving direct heir. Should that heir be unborn at the time of transfer, guardianship of the succession shall rest with the bearer until the child reaches the age of majority. Closed the folder. She placed one hand on her stomach and sat in the quiet of the study for 11 minutes, listening to the rain, which had begun while she was still at the dinner table and had not stopped. Then she stood, replaced everything in the drawer, locked it, and went to get some sleep. The next morning, Dante came to find her at 7. She was already dressed. She was sitting in the small chair by the east wing window with a cup of tea and a document. She was reviewing one of the shipping company's quarterly reports, dense with numbers. The kind of thing Dante had long since stopped pretending to understand himself. He had accountants for that. He had people. He stood in the doorway for a moment. He had clearly prepared something to say. She could see it in the way he was standing, the slight forward lean that meant he had rehearsed. Last night wasn't. "The quarterly numbers from the Harrison terminal are wrong," she said, without looking up from the document. Not wrong in a mistake way, wrong in a deliberate way. Someone has been skimming from the operational buffer for roughly 8 months. The amounts are small enough to avoid the automated flex, but they accumulate to slightly over $400,000. She turned a page. "I've noted the specific line items." He stared at her. "You should look at it before you bring in anyone from the accounting department," she continued, "because whoever is doing this, they have has access to the internal review schedule, which means they're inside the accounting department already. She set the document on the windowsill and finally looked at him. Good morning. His prepared speech was gone. She could see him recalibrating in real time the slight jaw set, the blink, the shift of weight from one foot to the other. That meant he was choosing between his pride and his interest was winning. Barely. How long have you known? 6 weeks. I wanted to be certain before I said anything. Why didn't you bring it to me sooner? I'm bringing it to you now, she said. Would you like the full analysis or just the summary? Question was not aggressive. It was simply a question. That was almost the worst part. For him, she could see it. He had come in ready for a fight. She had given him a problem and a solution. The transition from one mode to the other required a gear he wasn't always sure he had. Full analysis, he said. She handed him the document. He took it and stood there holding it and said, after a moment, last night wasn't. Dante. She picked up her tea. I'm not going to have that conversation today. Or this week. When I'm ready to have it, you'll know. She looked out the window at the rain, which had slowed overnight to a steady gray drizzle. Harrison's situation is more pressing. I'd start with a man in the department named Garvey. He's been there 7 years. He's good enough to be trusted with the review schedule, and he has a significant gambling problem that no one on your team knows about because they don't pay attention to the right things. She sipped her tea. Dante looked at the document in his hands. Then he looked at his wife by the window, already moving back to the gray world outside, like a woman whose mind was somewhere he couldn't follow. And he had the feeling, the first real articulation of it, though the roots had been growing for years, that there was a version of his empire he had never actually seen, that Seraphina had been living in it the whole time. He left the room with the document and said nothing more. Vivienne began moving her things into the East Wing 3 days later. Not dramatically, not with announcement. Gradually, a bag here, a garment there, a small cosmetics case set beside the mirror in the guest room, adjacent to Dante's private office, which was also adjacent to Seraphina's study. The adjacency was deliberate. Seraphina understood that the way she understood most things by watching what people chose to put next to what. What she did not do was react. The household staff watched for her reaction the way animals watch for weather. They had worked in the Veyron estate long enough to understand that the visible power and the actual power were not always the same person, and the person whose reaction mattered most in any given situation was not always the person doing the most obvious thing. They watched Seraphina. She moved through her days with the same precise steadiness. She oversaw the kitchen schedules. She reviewed the documents that arrived for her. She attended the 2 meetings per week that Dante held for senior family members, sitting where she had always sat, listening with the same quality of attention that Ferris Colt had once mistaken for disinterest. On the 4th day, Vivienne appeared at the door of Seraphina's study. She was wearing something expensive not quite appropriate for the time of day, the way people dress when they are asserting something they haven't fully claimed yet. She stood in the doorway for a moment as if she had expected to need to knock and found the door already open. Seraphina, she said. Seraphina looked up from the document she was reviewing. Vivienne, I just wanted to. Vivienne stopped, recalibrated. She clearly prepared this as well, and what she had prepared was not matching what she'd found. She had expected either confrontation or visible diminishment. She was getting a woman reviewing documents with the focused patience of someone who had a great deal of work to do and a finite number of hours. Sit down if you want, Seraphina said. Or don't. Either is fine. Vivienne sat. She sat in the chair across the desk, and for a moment she looked, stripped of the performance, like what she actually was. A 31-year-old woman who had made a very significant bet and was not entirely sure whether it had paid off or set something into motion that she didn't fully understand. I'm not your enemy, Vivienne said. I know that, Seraphina said. Then you're not? I'm not angry. She turned a page. Anger is a response to surprise. I wasn't surprised. She looked up again. What you should understand about me, not as a threat, simply as information, is that I have been navigating this family for 9 years. I have learned a great deal about it, including the people who interact with it from outside. She held Vivienne's gaze for 2 full seconds. I don't think you understand what you're actually in the middle of. Vivienne's chin lifted slightly. I know exactly what I'm in the middle of. I don't think so, Seraphina said. Not unkindly, but I hope you figure it out before it's too late to matter. She looked back at her document. Close the door on your way out, please. Vivienne left. Closed the door. Seraphina looked at the closed door for a moment, then looked at the bottom drawer of the desk. Then she went back to the document. Outside, the rain had finally stopped. The sky was the color of old iron, and the estate grounds were very still, the way places get still when something is about to change, not with noise, but in the particular silence of systems being reorganized beneath the surface, where no one is looking, or almost no one. In the east wing, Vivienne stood in the hallway outside the study and pressed her thumb against her phone screen. The message she typed was brief. It went to a number that was not saved in any contact list by name. The reply came within 90 seconds. Everything on schedule. Keep close. She slipped the phone into her pocket and walked toward Dante's office. Seraphina, at her desk, heard the footsteps recede down the corridor. She did not look up. She already knew which direction they were heading. She had known, in fact, for 11 months exactly where all the relevant footsteps in this house were heading. The only question that remained, and it was a question she had been turning over for the better part of a week, the way you work a stone in your palm until you understand its weight, was whether to let them all arrive where they were going, or whether to reroute them. She set down the document. She placed both palms flat on the desk. She thought about the baby. She thought about the succession bylaws. She thought about the 17 names in the bottom drawer, and the accounts that L would be preparing as of yesterday evening, and the recording she had held for 11 months, like a card she was not yet ready to lay down. She thought about the look on Seraphina Veyron's face at the dinner table 3 nights ago, that almost careful expression, that fraction of a second in which he had watched her walk out of the room, with something that was not concern and not amusement, and was something considerably more dangerous than either. She picked up her pen. She wrote a single name at the top of a blank page. Cassian. She looked at it. Then she began to write. Seraphina's pen had not stopped moving. The name at the top of the page was still Cassian, but beneath it now were 3 columns of information, each column in her smallest, most controlled handwriting. The handwriting she used when she needed to think through something without letting the thinking become visible in the size of the letters. Dates on the left, initials in the center, dollar amounts on the right. She had been building this particular page in her head for 4 months. Putting it on paper was not a decision. It was a confirmation. The baby shifted again. A smaller movement this time, less like protest and more like settling. She pressed one hand flat against her side and kept writing with the other. The thing about Seraphina Veyron was that he was careful. He was the kind of careful that looked like wisdom, which was the most dangerous kind, because wisdom was something people stopped questioning. He had been second in the family for 15 years. He attended every meeting. He offered measured counsel. He never visibly wanted anything. But Seraphina had watched him want things for 9 years. She had watched him look at Dante's chair. Not often, maybe 4 or 5 times in all those years, and never for more than a second, the way a man looks at something in a store window that he's decided he can't afford but can't quite stop looking at. That specific quality of wanting, the kind that lives below the level of conscious thought, was something most people never noticed. Seraphina had noticed it the second time she'd seen it. She had been building the file since then, not because she had known, not with certainty, but because certainty was for people who could afford to be wrong. She dated the bottom of the page, folded it once, and placed it inside the notebook. She locked the drawer. She stood, pressed her palm against the small of her back where the weight of the past 2 months had been accumulating like interest on a debt, and went to find out what the rest of the house was doing. What the rest of the house was doing was fracturing in small, careful increments. Staff had split along lines that nobody acknowledged, because acknowledging them would have required admitting that the lines existed. The housekeeper, a woman named Berta, who had worked in the estate for 11 years, and whose loyalty was to the building itself as much as to any person in it, continued to report to Seraphina out of habit and something closer to personal conviction. The 2 security men that Vivienne had quietly requested be repositioned to cover the East Wing corridor had begun eating their lunches separately from the rest of the security detail. Small things. The kind of small things that meant large things were organizing underneath. Ferris Colt noticed it before Dante did. This was not a surprise to anyone who paid attention, because Ferris Colt had been paying attention to the mechanics of the Veyron household for 12 years, and the specific way he paid attention quietly, without comment, without the kind of observation that invites other people to engage with what you've noticed was a methodology he and Seraphina had in common, though they had never discussed it. He found her in the East Wing corridor at 10:30 in the morning, 3 days after Vivienne's appearance in the study doorway. He was carrying a manila folder and walking toward Dante's office with the deliberate pace of a man who has adjusted his route by about 40 feet for a reason. "Mrs. Veyron," he said. "Ferris." She stopped. She had been walking toward the kitchen for tea and had not been redirected yet, which meant this was either accidental or he was being very careful about how it looked. She waited. He glanced down the corridor in both directions. The gesture was subtle, a slight turn of the head, not enough to read as checking unless you were already watching. She was already watching. "Harrison Terminal situation," he said, in the same tone someone uses to discuss weather. "Dante brought it to the accounting department yesterday. They've identified Garvey as the primary point of concern." "All right." He moved fast. Ferris adjusted the folder in his hands, which means someone told him to move fast, or told him he was about to be moved on. He paused. Garvey cleaned out his desk drawer before he was formally questioned. "Left the building. We don't know yet where he went." Seraphina absorbed this without showing what she was doing with it. "Does Dante know Garvey left?" "He knows now. He's handling it the way he handles things." Ferris said this without expression, which was itself a form of expression. The way Dante handled things involved pressure applied directly and immediately, which had the effect of solving some problems and accelerating others. "I thought you should know the timeline." "Thank you," she said. He nodded and continued toward the office. She continued toward the kitchen. She did not let herself think about what Garvey's disappearance meant until she had both hands around a hot mug and the kitchen was empty. Then she thought about it with full focus for approximately 90 seconds. Garvey had been skimming from the Harrison's operational buffer for 8 months. He had access to the internal review schedule, which meant someone inside the accounting operation had given it to him, which she had already factored in. What she had not fully factored, and she's disliked discovering she had not fully factored something. The way a surgeon dislikes discovering a complication mid-C procedure was that Garvey would receive a warning fast enough to clear his desk before a formal interview, which meant someone connected to Dante's own internal process was running information in the wrong direction. Not Ferris. She was certain of Ferris, as certain as she was of anything. She turned the mug in her hands and thought about Cassian's 3 columns. Garvey wasn't important. He was a mid-level skimmer who would be located, managed, and dealt with inside of a week. What was important was the information flow, the warning that had preceded the investigation, the speed of it, the fact that someone had been watching the accounting department's internal review schedule for 8 months and had not done so for their own benefit. Someone had installed Garvey. She set the mug down. She went back to her study and unlocked the drawer. Dante found her there 2 hours later. He didn't knock. He hadn't knocked on that door in 4 years, a habit she had stopped commenting on because the comment had never produced the knock. "Garvey's gone." He said it from the doorway, the way he delivered operational failures, flat, fronted, as if stating it quickly enough would reduce its weight. "I know," she said. "Ferris told me." Something moved across Dante's face. "He came to you before he came to me?" "He came to me after you. I was easier to find." She set down the document she was holding. "Someone warned Garvey ahead of your investigation. Fast enough that he had time to clear his desk and leave the building in an organized way, which means it wasn't panic. It was a protocol he had prepared in advance." She watched her husband absorb this. This wasn't opportunistic skimming. Garvey was placed there. Dante was quiet for 3 seconds. She counted them without meaning to. "By who?" "I don't know yet." The word "yet" was precisely chosen. "But whoever placed him has been inside your internal review structure for at least as long as Garvey has been skimming." which means they have eyes on your accounting operations that you haven't identified. You should have told me about this 6 weeks ago. The flatness in his voice had an edge under it now, the kind that appeared when Dante felt maneuvered and was deciding whether to name it. I told you as soon as I was certain enough that the information would be useful rather than preliminary. She held his gaze. If I had told you 6 weeks ago, you would have moved on Garvey before the trail was cold. Now it's cold and you've lost the thread. The edge sharpened. You made a unilateral decision about my operation. I made a decision about information I developed, she said, which is something I've been doing for 9 years while you ran the operation. The difference is that you're noticing it now. The room was very still. Dante stepped fully inside and closed the door behind him, which meant the conversation had become something he didn't want overheard. She read that correctly and stayed seated, which was also correct. Standing would have made it a confrontation, and confrontation was not what she needed from this particular moment. What else are you holding? He said. Quite a lot, she said honestly. Some of it you need now. Some of it you need later. The problem you have is that you don't trust my judgment about which is which. Should I? She looked at him, really looked at him, the way she used to in the early years before she'd learned that looking at people cost something and you had to choose when to spend it. He was tired. There was a specific kind of tired that settled in the jaw and the eyes simultaneously, and Dante had been carrying it since before Vivienne, before the crown, before any of the visible things. He had been carrying the weight of an empire that was larger than his father had built it and more exposed and more contested, and he had been carrying it in the way men like him carried things by not discussing it, by turning it into aggression when it became unbearable, by choosing the closest available source of uncomplicated attention and calling that stability. She did not feel sorry for him, but she understood him, which was something different and sometimes something more useful. You should trust my judgment, she said. You always should have, but you're going to have to decide that for yourself. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, tell me what I need now. She opened the notebook. She gave him 3 things. She gave him the name of the accounting department contact who had fed Garvey, the review schedule, a woman named Pell who had been recruited through financial pressure, not ideology, which meant she was manageable if approached correctly. She gave him the specific routing information for the 400,000 that Garvey had moved, which could be traced and partially recovered. And she gave him a name, not Cassian's name. Not yet. She was not ready to play that particular card, but a name 2 steps below. Cassian in the hierarchy she was beginning to see, a logistics coordinator named Sutter, who had been redirecting Veyron vehicles to routes that passed through Moretti-controlled territory at specific intervals. Dante listened. He took notes, which he almost never did. He had always relied on memory, which was another form of control, the refusal to let paper know what he knew. The fact that he was taking notes now was something she observed without commenting on. When she finished, he stood and put the notebook in his jacket pocket. The Sutter situation, he said. How long have you had that? Long enough. Seraphina, 3 months. She met his eyes. I needed to verify the pattern before I named someone to you. You move fast on a name. I needed to be right before you moved. He stood there. She could see him processing the full implication of what she had just said, not the specific information, but the structure of it. The fact that she had been sitting inside the information infrastructure of his empire for years with a clarity that he had never been able to fully see because he had never looked for it in the right direction. What else don't I know, he said. A great deal, she said. But we're going to have to build some trust before I give it to you. And I need you to understand something clearly, Dante. She stood now. She was only slightly shorter than him, and the pregnancy had changed her center of gravity in ways that made her stance more grounded, not less. The crown on Vivienne's head is a problem, not because of what it means to me, because of what it signals to the people who are actively working to dismantle your operation. It tells them that there is a fracture in this house, and they are going to use it. He said nothing. I am not asking you to reverse it publicly, she said. I understand what that would cost you. I'm asking you to understand what keeping it there is going to cost us. She put emphasis on the last word without theatrics. It landed where she intended it. Dante walked to the window. He stood with his back to her. for a moment. The grounds below were still November, gray, the trees stripped down. The kind of landscape that doesn't bother pretending to be anything other than what it is. Vivian's not going anywhere, he said. I know. She sat back down. Neither am I. He left without responding. The door closed behind him. Seraphina looked at the closed door and picked up her pen. She wrote a second name under Sutter's in the notebook, then a third. She was building a map, and the map was beginning to acquire a shape she had suspected it, but had needed the Garvey situation to confirm. The shape was a triangle. Vivian at the base, Sutter and whoever sat above him on the second tier, and at the apex, a figure who had been still and silver-haired and second for 15 years, watching Dante's empire from close enough to understand every joint and every weakness. She was almost ready to confirm the top of the triangle. She just needed one more piece. She got it that evening from a source she had spent 3 years cultivating and never compromised. A woman named Lena Farr, who was 54 years old and worked as a senior administrative assistant in a downtown law firm that handled legitimate contracts for the Veyron family's real estate holdings. Lena had not been recruited through pressure or through money, which made her unusual. She had come to Seraphina 3 years ago with a specific and carefully documented concern about the way certain holding company structures were being used, and she had come because she had observed Seraphina closely for 2 years before that and had concluded that Seraphina was the only person in the Veyron orbit who would know what to do with what she was carrying and who wouldn't make it dangerous for her. That judgment had proven correct. Lena called on the burner, the one Seraphina always answered before the second ring when that specific number appeared. Something came through the firm today, she said without preamble. They had never developed the habit of small talk, which was one of the things Seraphina valued most about her. A document request, private, came through Cassian Veyron's personal attorney, not the family's standard counsel. Seraphina held very still. What kind of document request, she said. Session verification. A pause. Specifically, the 1961 bylaws. He wanted a certified copy of the succession provision. The room seemed to contract slightly. Seraphina was aware of her own breathing slow, controlled, in through the nose, a technique she had developed in the early years of the marriage when breathing was sometimes the only thing she could control. Cassian was looking at the succession bylaws. Cassian was looking at the specific provision that governed what happened to the Empire if Dante was removed. When did the request come in? She said. This afternoon. 3 o'clock. 3 o'clock was 2 hours after Seraphina had given Dante the 3 pieces of information including Sutter's name, which meant either the timing was coincidental, which she did not believe, or Cassian had a way of knowing what moved inside that study. Her eyes went to the door. Closed. She had closed it herself. She thought about the security camera in the East Wing corridor, which had been installed 8 months ago as part of a broader estate security upgrade. She thought about who had overseen that upgrade. Cassian had overseen it. Lena, she said, don't respond to the request yet. Tell them you need additional verification of authority. You have standard latitude for that. I can hold it 48 hours without raising anything. 48 hours is enough. She paused. Thank you. Be careful, Lena said. The 2 words carried weight that a longer sentence wouldn't have. Seraphina ended the call. She sat in the chair with the burner phone in her hand and thought about the security upgrade and the cameras in the corridor outside her study. And she thought about every conversation she had held in this room in the past 8 months and whether any of them had been fully private. Then she stood up. She went to the desk. She pulled it 6 inches from the wall, which required effort at 8 months, but which she did without hesitating. She checked the underside of the desk, a habit she had developed in year 4, when she had first understood the kind of world she was living inside. She found nothing there. She checked the base of the lamp, the underside of the chair, the seam of the window frame where it met the interior wall. Behind the left curtain bracket, at approximately eye level for someone standing on a small ladder or chair, she found a device the size of a thumb, black, matte, a small LED indicator that was not currently illuminated. She stood looking at it for a long time. Then she left it exactly where it was. She walked back to the desk. She sat down. She picked up a blank piece of paper and began to speak quietly to herself, as if working through a document review something mundane about the shipping accounts, numbers, and dates, and nothing that would mean anything to anyone listening. Her voice was calm and unhurried. Her hands below the desk line were shaking slightly, not from fear, from the specific physical response to understanding, finally, and with full clarity, exactly what she was inside of. She had suspected Cassian. She had not known that he had been listening to her for 8 months, which meant he had been listening when she sent the text to G.L., which meant he knew about the accounts, which meant the 48 hours that Lena could hold the succession document request was not the window Seraphina needed to use. She had to assume he already knew what she had. She had to assume he was moving, which meant she had to move first. In the next 24 hours, for whatever Cassian had set in motion reached the point where it couldn't be interrupted, and she had to do it in a way that didn't reveal she had found the device. Because the moment she revealed that, she lost the only advantage she currently had over a man who had been listening to her for 8 months and believed, confidence of someone who had been planning for a very long time, that he already knew everything. She continued to murmur numbers at the empty room. Her hands steadied. She turned to a clean page in the notebook and began writing with the same controlled smallness as before, except this time the column on the left wasn't dates. Step 1, Step 2, Step 3. By the time she reached Step 7, she stopped writing and looked at what she had built. She read it twice. She changed one thing on a Step 4 and left everything else. Then she tore the page out, folded it into thirds, and held it against the lamp until it caught. She watched it burn down to the edge of her fingers, then dropped the last piece into the empty wastebasket and let it finish. She did not need the paper anymore. She had the sequence. Outside, the estate grounds had gone completely dark, and somewhere in the west wing, she could hear very faintly, through walls and corridors and the specific acoustics of a house that was too large and too full of people, pretending not to hear each other, the sound of Dante's voice, low and hard, talking to someone she could not identify. She listened. She could not make out the words, but she could make out the rhythm, and the rhythm was wrong too fast, too pressured, the rhythm of a man receiving information he had not prepared himself to receive. Pressed one hand against the desk and listened until his voice stopped. Then the west wing went quiet, and in the silence that followed, Seraphina Veyron understood that whatever Cassian had already set in motion, it had just entered its next phase, and she had approximately one night to get in front of it before the ground shifted beneath all of them in a way that no amount of preparation, no notebook, no 17 names in a locked drawer would be enough to navigate. She stood. She picked up the burner phone. She typed a different message this time, not 3 words but 7, and sent it to a contact the notebook listed only as R. M. Move the accounts tonight. All of them now. She put the phone in her pocket. She walked to the door. She opened it. The corridor was empty. The camera bracket above the east wind's entrance was exactly where it had always been. The little device behind the curtain was still not illuminated, which meant it was either dormant or recording, without indicator light, and she could not know which. And she decided it didn't matter. She had one night. She started walking. She was halfway down the corridor when the lights went out. Not the whole estate, just the east wing. A sectional cut, precise and deliberate, the kind that didn't happen from a blown fuse or a tripped breaker. Kind that someone who understood the electrical panel had executed on purpose, which meant someone who understood the electrical panel was already inside the house in a capacity that had not been authorized. Seraphina stopped walking. Complete darkness. No ambient light from the corridor windows because the exterior grounds lights had gone out simultaneously, which meant the cut was not internal. It was the main feed to this section of the building. She stood without moving for 3 full seconds, which was long enough to let her eyes begin adjusting, and long enough to hear, from somewhere below and to the west, a sound she identified immediately and correctly as the rear service entrance being opened. Not broken into, opened, with a key or a code. She pressed herself against the wall, flat, instinctive, the way you move in the dark, when you understand that moving through the center of a space makes you visible from 2 directions instead of 1. Her heart was hitting hard, but her breathing stayed controlled. in through the nose. Slow, the same technique. The baby was still. She was grateful for that. She needed to get to Dante. She needed to get to the West Wing. She moved along the wall with one hand trailing the plaster, counting door frames by feel. First door, linen storage. Second door, the guest room, where Vivienne had been staging her incremental occupation of the wing. She passed it. Third door, the connecting corridor that ran between the east and central sections of the house. She opened it. The central corridor had emergency lighting pale amber strips along the baseboards that cast just enough light to navigate without illuminating anything clearly. Seraphina moved faster. She passed two staff members frozen in a doorway, the younger kitchen assistant, a man named Torres, and Berta, who saw Seraphina and moved toward her immediately. Mrs. Veyron. Stay inside the kitchen, Seraphina said. Lock it. Don't open it for anyone who doesn't use the word November. She said it fast and quiet and kept moving. Berta, to her credit, did not ask questions. She pulled Torres back inside, and the kitchen door clicked shut. Seraphina heard voices from the West Wing now. Multiple. Male. The specific quality of voices that were not raised, but were compressed people communicating in the urgent shorthand of people, executing something they had rehearsed. She turned the corner into the West Wing corridor and stopped. 4 men she did not recognize were moving through the corridor in pairs, working from room to room. They were dressed in dark clothing, not uniforms, which would have been a different category of problem, but the deliberate anonymity of people who wanted to be unidentifiable before they were identified. 2 of them had weapons drawn. The other 2 carried what appeared to be equipment cases. None of them had seen her yet. She stepped back around the corner. She pressed her back against the wall and closed her eyes for 1 second, not fear, not prayer, pure calculation, and thought about the layout of the West Wing. Dante's office was at the far end. Between her and the office were 4 armed men who were not here to negotiate. Thought about the device behind the curtain bracket. She thought about Cassian requesting the succession documents at 3 o'clock. She thought about the message she had sent to RM. 11 minutes ago, she pulled out the burner phone and typed 1 word to Ferris Colt's number, a number she had memorized 4 years ago precisely for situations in which she could not speak. West. She sent it and put the phone back. Then she did something that cost her. She turned and walked away from Dante's office, back toward the central corridor, because going toward 4 armed men at 8 months pregnant, with no leverage and no exit route, was not courage. It was waste. And Seraphina Veyron had not spent 9 years building something she intended to waste. She found Dante before Ferris did. He was in the central corridor's secondary stairwell, which connected to a basement level used for storage, and, less officially, for conversations that needed not to be overheard by staff. He was with 2 of his own men, Reeves, and a senior enforcer named Barton, and all 3 of them were in the specific frozen mode of men who had just received information faster than they could process it. Dante saw her, and the first thing that crossed his face was relief, which he immediately covered with something harder. You need to get out of the house. I need you to listen to me first, she said. She was breathing hard from the walk, but her voice was level. There are 4 men in the West Wing corridor. They came through the rear service entrance. Someone gave them the code, I know. His jaw was rigid. Sutter. Sutter doesn't have the service entrance code, she said. That code is changed every 72 hours by a rotation your father established. The current holder is one of 3 people. She looked at him directly. One of them is you. One of them is Ferris. The third name sat between them without being spoken. Dante's face did something complicated. Don't say it. I've been trying not to for 4 months, she said. But we are past the point where not saying it is a choice either of us has. Reeves was very still. Barton had his hand near his weapon and was watching the stairwell door with the focused attention of a man who wanted very much to be dealing with a physical problem instead of this conversation. Cassian would not, Dante started. Cassian requested a certified copy of the Veyron succession provision from your family's law firm at 3 o'clock this afternoon, Seraphina said, through his personal attorney, not through standard family counsel. She watched her husband absorb this. Specific provision governing what happens to the Empire if you are removed. The silence in the stairwell was the kind that had weight. Dante's hands were flat against the wall. She could see the tendons in them, the specific muscular tension of a man holding himself very still, because if he let himself move, he was not sure what the movement would be. "How do you know that?" he said. "Because I've been paying attention to the right things for 9 years," she said. "Dante, we have to move. The men in the West Wing are looking for something. We need to know what, and we need to know if there are more of them in the house." He pushed off the wall. "The vault," he said. "Yes," she said. "That's what they're looking for." The Veyron family vault was not in the West Wing. It was in the basement, accessible through a door that looked like a utility panel, set into a wall behind the furnace room. The access code was changed monthly by Dante, and committed to memory. It had never been written down by anyone who valued their position in the family. But Seraphina had moved the fortune 6 weeks ago, not because she had anticipated tonight specifically, because she had anticipated the general shape of what tonight turned out to be, which was different from prediction, and considerably more useful. Dante hit the vault first. He went through the access sequence, the panel, the code, the secondary biometric, and pulled the door open. The vault interior was intact. The shelving, the document cases, the secondary safe for bearer instruments, all of it present, all of it empty. He stood in the vault doorway for a full 4 seconds without speaking. Then he turned around and looked at Seraphina. "Where is it?" he said. His voice had gone to a register she recognized, not loud, never loud, when he was at the real edge of something. Low and stripped of everything except the question. "Safe," she said. "I moved it 6 weeks ago. All of it. To 3 separate locations that are not connected to this estate or to any structure Cassian has access to. You moved the family fortune without telling me." "I moved it because I discovered someone was preparing to take it," she said. "And if I had told you, you would have confronted Cassian before I had enough to expose the full structure of what he's been building. We would have lost." Dante stepped out of the vault. He was close to her now. The stairwell had been tight, and the vault anteroom was tighter, and she could see the full complexity of what was moving through him. Fury. And underneath the fury, the beginning of something that looked like understanding, which was worse than fury in some ways, because understanding required him to accept certain things about himself that fury allowed him to defer. "If I wanted your money, Dante," she said quietly, "I wouldn't have left you breathing." He looked at her. She looked back. Then, from somewhere above them, something heavy and fast impacted the floor, with enough force to send vibration down through the building's structure, and all 4 of them looked up at the ceiling, and the sound that followed was unmistakable. Specific chain reaction percussion of the West Wing coming apart. Gunfire. Not a single shot. Multiple, the rapid irregular pattern of a situation that had stopped being controlled. Barton was through the basement door before Seraphina had fully processed the sequence. Reeves was behind him. Dante grabbed her arm, not rough, but certain, the grip of a man, making a decision, and pulled her toward the far end of the basement, away from the stairwell that led up into the West Wing. "There's a secondary exit," he said. "East side. Maintenance corridor." "I know where it is," she said. She pulled her arm back, not rejection, just accuracy, and moved ahead of him because she knew the basement layout, and she was not going to let him lead her somewhere when she knew the route better. The maintenance corridor was narrow and smelled of old concrete and pipe insulation. Emergency lighting here too, the same amber baseboards. She moved as fast as she could, which was not as fast as she needed to be, and she was aware of that gap between need and capacity with a cold precision that did not have room for frustration. Behind them, the sounds from above escalated, and then, with a quality that was almost more disturbing than the noise, suddenly stopped. The silence was wrong. Dante heard it too. She could tell by the way he slowed, for half a step before he caught himself, and kept moving. They came out through the maintenance exit into the rear grounds, a narrow strip of service road between the estate's east wall and the perimeter fence, not visible from the main building. Cold air hit her hard. November in Chicago at 11 at night was a specific kind of cold, the kind that immediately strips away any ambient warmth you've been carrying and replaces it with its own absolute standard. Ferris Colt was already there. He was standing beside a dark car with his jacket gone and his shirt torn at the left shoulder, and there was blood on the side of his face from a cut above his ear that was still running. He looked at Seraphina, first checking, then at Dante. How many? Dante said. Started with 6. 2 of mine took 2 of theirs. The other 4 pulled back to the west wing. Ferris touched the cut on his face, without looking at it, a reflexive gesture. They weren't there for people, Dante. They were there for the vault. Vault's empty, Dante said. Ferris absorbed this. Then he looked at Seraphina again, and the look he gave her was the specific look of a man who is recalibrating something fundamental about his understanding of the situation. Okay, he said, which was not a simple word when Ferris Colt said it. Vivienne is still in the house, Seraphina said. West wing. Both men looked at her. She's not in danger, Seraphina said. She wasn't supposed to be in the west wing when this happened, which means she arranged to be there. Dante's expression closed down. What are you saying? I'm saying the 4 men who came through the service entrance were not looking for the vault as their primary objective. She watched his face. They were looking for you. The vault was secondary, something to secure, once the primary objective was complete. She paused. Vivienne knew the layout. She knew your patterns. She knew which night you'd be in the West Wing office, after 11, because you've been in the West Wing office after 11 every Tuesday for 2 years. She looked at him steadily. Tonight is Tuesday. The blood on Ferris's face had reached his jaw and was dropping onto the collar of his shirt, and he hadn't moved to stop it, and she didn't think he knew it was happening. Dante said nothing. Face had gone to something she had seen only twice before, in 9 years, a stillness that was not calm, but was the precise opposite of calm. The stillness of someone at the absolute threshold of what they can process while remaining functional. She was supposed to be out of the wing before 11. Seraphina continued. She arranged it so you'd come to the office. She arranged it so the men would come in at 11:15 when you'd be alone, with Reeves and Barton positioned too far down the corridor to intervene in time. She paused. She's been planning this for at least 3 months. How do you know that? Dante said. The same register as before, stripped and flat. Because I've been watching her plan it, Seraphina said. Cold was very present. A wind moved along the east wall and disturbed the dry grass at the perimeter fence and then settled. From somewhere inside the building, muffled by walls and distance, there was a single sound, sharp and brief, that might have been a door or might have been something else. You let it go this far, Dante said. Yes, you watched it happen and you didn't stop it. I was building a full picture, she said. Stopping it at any earlier point would have closed the exits. I needed every exit closed before I moved. She held his gaze. I needed to know who was behind Vivienne. Not just that she was in contact with the Morettis. Behind her, the person directing her. Ferris was very still. Dante said Cassian. Yes, she said, but I needed it to be undeniable. I needed a night like tonight, where everyone moves at once, because that's the only circumstance in which Cassian moves in a way that exposes him completely. She kept her voice level. He's been behind the curtain for 8 months at minimum, probably longer. Vivienne was a mechanism he used to create the visible fracture in your house. Crown ceremony that was his design, not hers. He fed her the idea. He made sure she understood what placing the crown on her head would do to your internal relationships, to your captain's confidence, to the family's perception of your stability. Dante's breathing had changed. She could hear it. He used her, Seraphina said, and he used you. And he used the fact that you never looked at me as a serious piece of the equation, because that was the biggest vulnerability. You had not your operations, not your rivals, but the assumption that the woman inside this house was decorative. She stopped. He built his entire strategy on that assumption, because it was yours first. The silence that followed was the longest of the night. Dante looked at her in the amber-tinged dark outside the estate he had inherited, outside the house where the woman he had publicly humiliated had just explained to him that she was the only reason he was standing here alive and not inside. And whatever he felt, and she could see that he felt a great deal, that the stillness was costing him something significant to maintain. He did not give it words. He turned to Ferris. Get the car. Already running, Ferris said. Seraphina. Dante turned back to her. The locations where you moved the accounts. Are they secure tonight? Yes. Are you certain? I'm certain, she said. They were moved before Cassian knew I'd found the device. Ferris paused with his hand on the car door. What device? Behind the curtain bracket, in my study, Seraphina said. Installed during the security upgrade 8 months ago. She looked at Ferris. Found it 4 hours ago. I left it in place. Ferris closed his eyes for exactly 1 second. When he opened them, his expression had the quality of a man doing rapid damage assessment on a very large structure. Everything I said in that room for 8 months. Seraphina continued. Cassian heard. Which means he knows about the Black Ledger. She said it flat, without drama, because the drama would not help anything. He knows the names. He knows the network. He's known for however long I've been building it. Dante turned to look at her fully. If he knows the network, he said slowly, then he's already moving on it. Yes, she said. He is. The car was running. Ferris had the back door open. She got in, and Dante got in beside her, and Reeves took the front Barton, who had appeared from somewhere in the last 60 seconds with a weapon she was choosing not to look at directly, took the other front seat. Car moved. She looked out the rear window at the estate, receding at the dark windows of the east wing, at the one light still burning in the west wing, that she had not seen from the outside before, that should not have been there. Vivian's light, burning alone in the west wing where the men with equipment cases had been. Seraphina stared at it until the car turned, and the estate disappeared behind the tree line, and she thought about what Castian now knew, and what it meant for every name in the notebook she had burned the page of, but had not burned the network of. He knew about the Black Ledger. He knew the lawyers and the bankers and the drivers and the 2 captains who had owed their positions to Seraphina's quiet engineering rather than to Dante's visibility. He knew the shape of the second structure she had been building inside the first, which meant the network was compromised, which meant the protection she had spent 4 years constructing around herself, around the baby, around the legitimate position she had been planning to occupy when all of this finally broke open was compromised. She had one functional advantage remaining. One thing she had never said in the study, never written on paper that hadn't been burned, never communicated through any channel that passed through the estate. The location of the money. 3 separate locations. 3 separate structures, held in instruments that required her physical authorization, not a signature, not a code. Her physical presence, her biometric confirmation, her face. Cassian could not access the money, not without her. She understood, sitting in the back of the moving car, with the estate gone behind her, and the city beginning to accumulate on either side of the road, exactly what that meant, exactly what it made her. She was not a woman who had been forced out of her home. She was the only person on the planet who could unlock the Veyron family's emergency fortune. And Cassian Veyron, who had spent 8 months listening to her build something, who had spent 15 years waiting for a version of this night, who had arranged the crown ceremony and the men through the service entrance, and Vivian's manufactured love affair and the listening device and the succession document request. Cassian Veyron was about to realize that all of his preparation had produced a situation in which the one thing he needed was the one thing that could only be given by the woman he had spent 9 years dismissing as irrelevant. Dante was looking at the road ahead. She looked at her own hands in her lap, steady now, the shaking from the study gone, replaced by the specific stillness that came after decisions were made and before consequences arrived. Her left hand, ringless since the dinner table. Her right hand, pressed flat against her stomach, where the baby had begun moving again. Small circular movements, the way a person shifts weight when they are waiting for something. She thought about the sequence she had burned. Step 1 through step 7. She had burned the paper. She had not burned the knowledge. She looked out the window at the city passing. She thought about Cassian sitting somewhere in his own house, in a car, in a room where men reported to him about what they had and had not found tonight, and she thought about the moment would understand what she understood right now. She thought that the night had not gone the way either of them had planned, that the net she had been building had been seen and compromised, but the one thread he could not reach had held, that he was going to need her, and that, needing her after everything, was going to cost him everything. Closed her eyes. She breathed in slowly. She breathed out. She opened her eyes and said, to no one in particular, in a voice that was so quiet, it nearly disappeared beneath the road noise. Take me to the Harrison building. Ferris looked in the rearview mirror. Dante turned. The Harrison building, she said again. There's something there I need to get before Cassian's people do. What's in the Harrison building? Dante said. She looked at him. The rest of the ledger, she said. The Harrison building was a 12-story commercial property on the near north side that the Veyron family held through a shell company, 3 entities deep, the kind of ownership structure that looked like nothing from the outside and was designed to look like nothing. The ground floor was a legitimate freight brokerage that Seraphina had overseen the books of for 6 years. The 4th floor was empty by design. The 8th floor was where she was going. Ferris pushed the car hard through the night streets. It was past midnight now. The city thinned to the specific late-night population that didn't ask questions and didn't look at cars moving fast through intersections. And nobody spoke for the first 4 minutes of the drive. Then Dante said, "How much of the ledger is there?" "Enough," Seraphina said. "I need a number." 14 months of documented transactions, she said. Every payment Cassian made outside the family structure. Every contact with the Moretti organization. The full chain from Cassian to Vivienne to the men who came through the service entrance tonight. She paused. And the succession document requests. All 3 of them. Dante turned 3. Tonight's request was the 3rd, she said. He's been building toward this for longer than 8 months. The first request was made 22 months ago. He withdrew it 2 days later, which is why it didn't surface through normal channels. She looked at her husband. He's been planning to remove you since before Vivienne. Car went over a rough patch of road, and the impact moved through her spine, and she absorbed it without sound. The baby pushed back against her ribs, the same assertive pressure as before. The pressure of something that intended to be present, whether or not the moment was convenient. She pressed her hand against her side and kept her breathing even. 22 months, Dante said. Not a question. The tone of a man doing arithmetic about his own life. He needed the right mechanism, she said. Something that would fracture the internal structure, enough that your captains would question succession. Vivienne was the mechanism. The crown ceremony was the signal to the Moretti family, to anyone watching from outside, that the Veyron house was breaking, that it was time to move. Ferris said, from the front, he timed the attack for tonight specifically. Yes, Seraphina said. Because tonight was the first gathering of all senior family members since the crown ceremony. The narrative was already established. Dante is distracted. His wife has been publicly displaced. His judgment is compromised. If something happened to Dante tonight, the succession question would already be seated. Cassian steps in as stabilizing authority. The captains accept it because the alternative is chaos. Reeves, in the front passenger seat, had not said a word since the basement stairwell. He was 28 years old and had been in the Veyron organization for 4 years, and Seraphina could see the back of his neck, which was very tight, the neck of a young man recalibrating everything he thought he understood about the structure he worked inside. The Harrisons' building appeared ahead, dark windows, a single exterior light above the freight entrance, the anonymous face of a building that had been designed to receive no attention. Stay in the car, Dante said to Reeves and Barton. No. Seraphina opened her door before the car fully stopped, which was not elegant, but was necessary. Barton comes. We need 3 sets of eyes inside. She looked at Dante. Cassian's people could already be here. Dante looked at her. He did not argue. The freight entrance code was a 6-digit sequence that Seraphina had set herself 3 years ago and had never shared with anyone inside the estate. Punched it in, and the door released, and Ferris went in first, with Barton behind him, both moving the way men move when they expect to find something wrong, and are preparing their bodies before their minds make the final decision. The freight lobby was empty, dark, smelling of old cardboard and the specific industrial cold of a building that is heated only enough to prevent pipe damage. The elevator was too slow and too obvious. Seraphina went to the stairwell door. 8, she said. Ferris looked at her abdomen. I'll manage, she said. Go. They went. She went. 8 floors of concrete stairs, one hand on the railing, counting the landings, not fast but steady, the pace of someone who is committed to a thing and is not going to negotiate with the difficulty of it en route. Dante stayed at her shoulder. He did not offer his arm, which was the right instinct. She would not have taken it, and the offer would have cost both of them something. He simply stayed close. By the 4th floor, her lower back was a hard, specific ache that was distinct from the pregnancy discomfort she had been carrying for 2 months. By the 6th, it had sharpened into something that took active management. She breathed through it and kept moving. 8th floor. Ferris was already at the far end of the corridor, weapon drawn, checking the office doors in sequence. Barton covered the stairwell entrance behind them. Seraphina moved to the 3rd door on the left, a frosted glass door that read Archival Services in faded lettering that had been there when the Veyrons acquired the building and had never been relevant enough to remove. She punched a different code into the secondary panel beside the handle. 8 digits, one she had committed to memory with the same method she used for everything critical. Repetition over time until it occupied the same neural address as her own name. The door opened. The room inside was a converted storage space metal, shelving, fluorescent lighting activated by a motion sensor that kicked on with a faint flicker when she entered. On the second fence shelf from the bottom, behind 2 bankers' boxes of genuinely boring archived freight invoices, was a 3rd box that was not labeled. She pulled it out. She opened it. Inside, a black external hard drive, a folder of physical documents, and a secondary burner phone in a sealed bag. She picked up the hard drive first, then the folder. She did not open either. She knew what was in them. She had built them. Opening them now would be sentiment, and sentiment was not something she had budget for at this moment. She turned around. Dante was in the doorway. He was looking at the box, at the drive in her hand, at the folder. His face was doing the complicated thing again. The thing where multiple, incompatible pieces of information were fighting for a single expression. "How long has this been here?" he said. 14 months. "You've been building this for 14 months. Longer," she said. "The Harrison-specific material is 14 months. He crossed to her in 3 steps and stopped close enough that she could see the exhaustion in him properly. For the first time, the redness in his eyes, a specific drawn quality around his mouth that meant he had been running on something other than sleep for longer than he'd admitted to himself. Seraphina. He said her name like it was a question that needed a different kind of answer than information. "Not right now," she said. Not unkind. Accurate. She moved past him into the corridor. Ferris was at the far end with his phone pressed to his ear. He lowered it and looked at them, and his expression had tightened into something that had an edge she didn't like. "We have a problem," he said. "Which one?" Dante said. Cassian called a council meeting. Ferris said it the way you pull a pin. Emergency session. 2 hours from now. He's calling it as acting senior authority pending. He stopped, and the stop was itself information pending confirmation of Dante's status. Corridor was very quiet. His words, Ferris said. Confirmation of Dante's status. Dante's jaw went rigid. "He's moving tonight," Seraphina said. "He knows the attack on the estate failed. He's pivoting to the institutional play, calling the council, before you can re-establish your position, before word gets out that you're alive and operational." She ran the math at speed. "The council convenes without you, present, and Cassian presents a story about the attack that positions you as compromised or missing. The captains vote on interim leadership as a procedural matter." She looked at Dante. "He doesn't need you dead. He just needs you absent for 2 hours. "Where's the meeting?" Dante said. "Caro Club," Ferris said. "Private room East building." Seraphina knew the Caro Club. Private member space downtown. 16 blocks from the Harrison. Building the kind of place that prided itself on discretion and had spent 40 years earning that pride. The Veyrons had been members since 1078. "How many of our captains has Cassian reached?" she said. "Ferris," Dante said, working on it. Ferris's phone was back at his ear. Seraphina stood in the 8th floor corridor of the Harrison's building with the hard drive and the folder and the understanding that the window they were operating in had just become significantly smaller. She thought about the 7 captains who constituted the senior council. She thought about which of them owed positions that traced back through her quiet engineering versus which of them were Cassian's by inclination or fear. 3 were hers. She was certain of 3. 2 were uncertain. 2 she had always known were Cassian's, going back to before Vivienne, before the crowning, back to the years when Cassian was building his version of a second structure inside Dante's empire with considerably less subtlety than her own and considerably more existing authority. The two uncertain ones voted with Cassian. The count was 4-3. Enough for the procedural motion. "I need to call someone," she said. "You can call from the car," Dante said. He was already moving. "I need to call now." She was dialing on the burner before he could respond. The line picked up on the second ring a man's voice, 50-something, with the compressed alertness of someone who had been expecting a call and was not fully asleep. "Raymond," she said. "It's happening tonight. Caro Club. 2 hours." Raymond Hale was one of the two uncertain captains. He was 53 years old, 20 years in the Veyron organization, and his uncertainty was not ideological. He was a man who would stand behind the version of the Veyron family that seemed most likely to survive. He had been watching the crown ceremony aftermath, with the focused attention of a man calculating odds. "I hear you," Raymond said. "You know what I have," Seraphina said. "You know what the ledger means. If Cassian takes the council tonight, the ledger becomes public, and your name is on page 11. Pause. "What page 11, Raymond?" Her voice was flat. "Page 11. Another pause. "I'll be at the Caro Club," he said. "Then, will you?" She looked at Dante, who was looking at her with an expression that had moved past complicated into something rawer. "Yes," she said. "I'll be there." She ended the call. "You're not going to the Caro Club," Dante said. "I am," she said. "'Cause without me standing there physically, with this," she held up the hard drive. "Raymond votes with the room. And the room is currently Cassian's room." She met his eyes. "You need your wife standing beside you tonight, not because of the crown, because the captains need to see that everything Cassian told them about the state of this house is a lie." Dante stood in the corridor of the Harrison building at 12:30 in the morning, and he looked at the woman in front of him, 8 months pregnant. No ring on her left hand, holding a hard drive that contained the documented destruction of a man who had spent 22 months building toward tonight, and he said nothing for long enough. That Ferris and Barton had both become very interested in the wall. "You could have stopped this earlier," Dante said finally. "You could have brought me the evidence months ago." "Yes," she said. "Why didn't you?" She looked at him steadily. "Because 4 months ago, you would have taken the evidence and moved on Cassian, and the operation would have been disrupted but not destroyed. The Moretti connection would have survived. Vivienne would have disappeared quietly, and the leak in your structure would have closed, but the structure itself, the rot inside it, would still be there." She held his gaze. "I needed it to come to a head, all of it, at once, so that every person who chose the wrong side does so visibly, in front of everyone, with no ability to claim they didn't know. You were willing to let it get this dangerous. I was willing to let it get exactly this dangerous," she said, "because the alternative was a house that remained sick at its foundation for another 22 months, while Cassian built his next version of the same plan." Dante breathed out through his nose. It was not quite a sigh and not quite a concession, and it was the most honest sound she had heard from him in years. "Let's go," he said. The Caro Club occupied a corner of the downtown grid that had not changed significantly. In 50 years, dark brick, brass fixtures, windows that let in no light and gave none back. It was 12 minutes from the Harrison building. Ferris drove, and Seraphina used those 12 minutes. She used them to call the second uncertain captain, a man named Dresch, who was 47, and had a specific financial arrangement with the Veyron family that Seraphina had been aware of for 3 years, and had never used as leverage, because leverage spent too early was leverage wasted. She spent it now. She did not threaten. She simply explained, in 3 sentences, what the ledger contained and what a public disclosure of its contents would do to a man with Dresch's specific financial arrangement. Then she told him what she needed from him at the Caro Club. Dresch said, "You should have been running this family from the start." "I know," she said, and ended the call. Dante, beside her, had heard both calls. He was looking at the window. She could see his jaw working, not anger. Something more interior than anger, the specific muscular activity of a man digesting information about himself. The car stopped a block from the Caro Club. Ferris turned in his seat. 3 of Cassian's people are confirmed on the door, he said. "Not club staff, his people." "He owns the door," Dante said. "He thinks he does," Seraphina said. She opened her door. Cold hit immediately. Ferris, the service entrance. Already called it, Ferris said. Sir. He had his phone out and was typing while he spoke. Give me 4 minutes. She stood on the sidewalk outside the Caro Club at 12:43 in the morning and looked at the brass fixtures and the window and thought about the room inside where Cassian Veyron was currently presenting a version of Tonight to 5 captains in which he was the stabilizing force and Dante Veyron was a variable that had been neutralized. Dante came to stand beside her. When we go in, she said, let me lead for the first 90 seconds. He looked at her. 90 seconds, she said again. After that, it's yours. Something crossed his face that was not quite pride, and not quite the absence of pride, and was something she didn't have a clean word for. All right, he said. Ferris has appeared from the alley beside the building. Service doors open, he said. Kitchen staff cleared out the back. They went through the kitchen industrial smells. Stainless steel, the residual warmth of a kitchen that had been operational until an hour ago, and through the corridor behind the service bar, and then Ferris opened the door that led into the private corridor, and Seraphina could hear Cassian's voice from the room at the end of the hall. Could hear him clearly. He had the voice of a man who had been waiting 15 years for a room to belong to him and had finally, tonight, decided it did. The situation at the estate makes it unambiguous. Cassian was saying, whatever Dante's current position, we cannot leave the family without functional leadership while we wait to determine. She opened the door. The private room was long a table, 7 chairs, 4 of them currently occupied. Cassian at the head, Raymond to his left, face unreadable, Dresch at the far end, and 2 captains whose names were Holst and Price, both of whom she knew were Cassian's, in the way she knew most things by watching, over years, where their eyes went when Dante's back was turned. Cassian stopped speaking. The room looked at the door. Seraphina walked in first. She was aware of exactly how she looked, 8 months pregnant, dressed in the clothing she'd been wearing since that morning. No ring, hard drive in her hand, and she allowed herself to be looked at for 2 full seconds before she said anything, because those 2 seconds were doing work. She needed every man in that room to spend 2 seconds recalibrating what they thought they were about to be told. Cassian, she said. Her voice was absolutely level. You requested a certified copy of the Veyron succession provision this afternoon at 3 o'clock, through your personal attorney. She set the hard drive on the table. That request is the 37th documented action in a coordinated effort to remove Dante Veyron from the leadership of this family. The prior 36 are on this drive. She looked at him directly. Would you like to discuss any of them? Or would you prefer to begin with the Moretti payments? The room was the specific silence of people who have just had the ground shift under them. Cassian's face did something extraordinary. Not fear. Fear was too simple for what moved across Cassian Veyron's features in that moment. It was the expression of a man watching a structure he has spent years building reveal. From the outside, a flaw he had calculated did not exist. Then Dante walked through the door behind her, and the silence became something else entirely. Holst and Price both moved in their chairs, small movements, involuntary, the physical language of men whose calculations had just been overturned. Raymond looked at the table. Dresch looked at Dante, and then at Seraphina, and his expression had the quality she had heard in his voice on the phone. A man arriving at a conclusion he should have reached earlier. Cassian stood. He was 61 years old, silver-haired, and in the specific motion of standing, he managed something impressive. He managed to make the act of being caught look like a choice. Dante, he said, the same measured voice, the same controlled register. I'm glad you're alive. We had conflicting reports about the estate. I'll bet you did, Dante said. Whatever Seraphina has told you. Sit down, Cassian, Dante said. The room went very still. Cassian did not sit. The drive, Seraphina said, to the room, rather than to Cassian specifically, is a copy. The original is held outside this building by an individual whose name is not connected to this family. with instructions to deliver its contents to 3 separate parties in the event that I am unable to personally confirm my status every 24 hours. He looked around the table at Raymond, at Dresch, at Holst and Price. I want everyone in this room to understand that clearly. Whatever happens tonight, the ledger exists, and the ledger is distributed. Price said, to no one in particular, how much is on it. Enough, she said, including your name once. Price looked at the table. Holst looked at Cassian. Cassian looked at Seraphina with an expression she had been waiting, without knowing she was waiting, 9 years to see on his face. The expression of a man who had built his entire strategy on an assumption and was standing inside the moment of that assumption's collapse. He had assumed she would run. He had assumed that a woman 8 months pregnant, publicly humiliated, stripped of her position within the family structure, operating without the formal authority she needed, that she would run, or at minimum would not arrive at the Caro Club at 12:43 in the morning and lay 14 months of documented evidence on the table before anyone had time to build a story to counter it. He had listened to her for 8 months, and he had understood the information she was building, but he had not understood her. You should have moved faster, she said to him. And something cracked in Veyron's careful face, a single line, barely visible, like the first fracture in something that has been under pressure for too long. His hand moved. It moved to the inside of his jacket, fast, the speed of a man who has realized that every other option has been closed, and Dante moved at the same time, crossing the distance between them in 2 strides. And Cassian's hand came out of the jacket with a weapon, and Dante's hand closed on his wrist for its pulsal. Impact of the collision hit the table hard enough to scatter everything on it. Seraphina stepped back, not retreating, placing herself correctly, back against the wall, out of the line of anything that was about to travel across the room. Holst was on his feet. Price was against the far wall. Raymond had not moved from his chair, which told her everything she needed about Raymond. Barton came through the door 2 seconds behind Dante, and Ferris behind him, and the room became a question of numbers and proximity, and the specific algebra of who was standing where and who had what in their hands. Cassian had the most dangerous thing in the room, and it was not the weapon. He had the voice, and he used it now, loud for the first time, stripped of the 15 years of careful, measured counsel. Raw underneath, the voice that had been sitting behind the other one for a very long time. You think a woman with a ledger and a drive is going to hold this family? He was looking at the captains, not at Dante, and that was the tell. He was still calculating, still trying to work the room even with Dante's hand on his wrist. She has documents. I have been running the actual operations of this family for 8 years while Dante played at being his father. Enough, Dante said. He said it very quietly, and something in the register of it, the specific flatness of a man who has run out of the version of himself that was willing to hear more, landed in the room with more weight than the shout had. Cassian's wrist was still in Dante's grip. The weapon was still in Cassian's hand. The room was the specific frozen tableau of people waiting to discover which direction the next 3 seconds would go. Seraphina looked at the table. The hard drive had slid to the edge during the collision. It was sitting at the corner of the table 2 inches from falling. She reached out and picked it up. She held it. She looked at Cassian Veyron, the silver hair, the controlled face with its single fracture line, the eyes that had been watching Dante's chair for 15 years from the most careful distance, and she said very clearly to the room, this man arranged the attack on the estate tonight. He arranged Vivienne Cross's recruitment by the Moretti family. He installed a listening device in my private study. He requested the Veyron succession provision 3 times in 22 months. She paused. And he built every piece of it on the assumption that no one in this family was paying close enough attention to see it. She looked at Holst, at Price, at Raymond. I was paying attention, she said. Holst sat back down. Price looked at Cassian with the expression of a man completing a calculation and not liking the answer. And Raymond steady, 53-year-old Raymond, who had ridden every shifting wind in the Veyron organization. For 2 decades, Raymond looked at Seraphina and gave the smallest nod she had ever seen constitute a decision. Cassian felt it happen. She could see it in his body, the specific moment when a man realizes the room is no longer his. The way something goes out of the posture, not collapse, but subtraction. The architecture remaining, but the load-bearing element removed. His grip on the weapon did not loosen. Dante had not loosened his grip on Cassian's wrist. And in the long, breathless pause between what had just happened and what was about to happen next, Seraphina felt the baby push hard against her ribs, once, twice, a third time, insistent and alive, and she pressed her free hand against her side and breathed in Rus and held the hard drive in her other hand, like the thing it was, not a weapon, not a threat, but the simple, complete, documented record of a truth that had been waiting 14 months for exactly this room. The next sound in the room was Cassian's weapon hitting the table, and after that, everything that was still standing began to fall. Cassian's weapon on the table made a sound like a period at the end of a very long sentence. Nobody moved for 3 seconds. Then Dante released his uncle's wrist and stepped back, not retreat. The deliberate withdrawal of a man choosing what kind of moment this becomes. And the room breathed again. Shallow and careful, the breath of people who have been watching something at the edge of irreversible and are only now beginning to accept that it has not gone over. Cassian stood at the head of the table with his hand open and empty. The fracture line in his face had spread. He looked, for the first time in 15 years of Seraphina's observation, like his actual age, like a 61-year-old man who has been holding something very heavy for a very long time and has just been told he can put it down. Except that putting it down means the thing he was carrying crushes him on the way to the floor. It was supposed to be mine, he said. Not to Dante. Not to the room. The way people say things that have been inside them so long they've stopped being directed at anyone specific. I know, Dante said. Your father chose you because you were louder. Cassian looked at his nephew. Not better. Louder. He confused noise for strength his entire life, and then he handed you an empire that needed someone who could think. And you could think, Dante said. I kept this family alive for 8 years, while you made decisions that should have gotten us all killed. Cassian's voice had the quality of something that has stopped performing. Raw underneath, the way wood is raw when you strip the finish. 8 years, Dante. I managed the relationships your arrogance damaged. I cleaned up the operations your impatience broke. I built the alliances you never knew existed because you never asked. I know, Dante said again. Seraphina looked at her husband. He was not arguing. That was new. In 9 years of watching Dante navigate challenges to his authority, she had never seen him receive a grievance without armoring against it. He was standing at the side of the table in a private room at the Caro Club at 1 in the morning, and he was listening to his uncle describe 15 years of invisible labor with the specific quality of attention of a man hearing something he has known, somewhere below consciousness, for a long time. You should have told him, Seraphina said, not to wound Cassian, to identify precisely where the fracture had actually begun. Cassian looked at her. You should have told him what you were doing and what it cost you, she said. Instead, you built resentment in the dark and called it patience. And then you built a plan to take what you decided you deserved, and you called that justice. She held his gaze steadily. You were wronged. I believe that. But the way you responded to being wronged made you into something that cannot be allowed to stand. Cassian looked at her for a long time. His expression had moved through several things and arrived at something that was not quite defeat and not quite acceptance, and was the complicated territory between them where most lives actually end up. You're very good, he said. Yes, she said. I am. Ferris stepped forward. Cassian Veyron. He said it like a formal thing because it was a formal thing. You're done here. They held Cassian in a private arrangement that night, not the police. Not yet. Because the contents of the letter implicating Cassian also implicated enough of the infrastructure around him that releasing it into the legal system required the kind of preparation that couldn't be done at 1 in the morning with 4 captains watching and a baby that was running out of patience with the situation. Seraphina made that call in the car on the way back to the Harrison building, where she intended to coordinate the next phase from a location that was not the compromised estate. She made it calmly to a lawyer named Voss, who was on the list in the drawer, and who answered at 1:15 in the morning, with the focused alertness of a man who had been told years ago that this call would eventually come and had decided to believe it. The Harrison building, she said. 40 minutes. Bring the secondary filing. It's ready, Voss said. She ended the call. Dante, beside her, said, You have a lawyer on retainer for this. I have several, she said. The one who handles the criminal exposure is different from the one who handles the succession documentation. They don't know about each other. He was quiet for a moment. Succession documentation. The bylaws establish that our child is the next primary heir in the event of your removal, she said. I've had papers prepared that formally recognize that succession and establish guardianship structure in the event that both of us are incapacitated simultaneously. It's been ready for 6 months. She looked at the window. I didn't anticipate using it this way. I intended it as a protection measure. But given tonight, formalizing it now establishes the family's structural continuity in writing before the council reconvenes in the morning. Dante said nothing for a long time. The city moved past the window, the specific depth of night, when Chicago shows its actual face, stripped of daytime performance. Streets belonging to the people who have nowhere to be, and the people who have very urgent places to be, and almost no one in between. I need to ask you something, he said. She waited. The baby, he said. He stopped, started differently. Did you choose to have the baby because of the succession bylaws? She looked at him. The question had cost him something to ask. She could see in the set of his shoulders the way his hands were resting flat on his thighs, the posture of a man who has asked something he cannot unask and is waiting to find out whether the answer destroys or simply damages. No, she said. He looked at her. The baby is the reason I started building the rest of it, she said. Not the instrument of it. She held his gaze. I found out I was pregnant, and I understood in about 48 hours that the structure of this family as it existed was not safe for a child, not because of what the family is, because of the specific vulnerabilities that had been accumulating for years. Cassian, the Moretti pressure, the internal leaks you couldn't see because you didn't know where to look. She paused. I started building because I needed the house to be sound before the baby arrived in it. That's the whole of it. The car moved through a long intersection. That's the whole of it, he repeated. Yes. He looked at the window. She looked at the window. The space between them, in the back seat of the car, was not comfortable and was not resolved and was not going to be either of those things tonight, which was correct. Because some things cannot be rushed into resolution without losing in something essential in the rushing. But it was honest. It was the most honest the space between them had been in 9 years. And that was enough for now to work with. The next 3 hours were administrative in the way that only people who have lived inside complex organizations understand administration can be brutal. Voss arrived at the Harrison building at 1:58 with 2 associates and a briefcase that contained, among other documents, the succession certification, the formal ledger filing, and a civil legal structure that would protect the family's legitimate business holdings from any fallout generated by the criminal exposure of the Moretti connection. Seraphina sat at the table in the 8th floor room and worked through it document by document. Her back was a sustained, radiating problem that she managed by not sitting for more than 20 minutes at a time, standing at the window between sessions, pressing her knuckles into the small of her back and breathing through it. Voss watched her do this, with the expression of a man who wanted to suggest she stop and had enough sense to understand she wouldn't. Dante sat across the table from her and went through the documents she passed to him, signing what needed signing, reading what needed reading. He had never particularly liked paperwork, which was one of the several reasons legitimate business infrastructure had been slowly devolving for 4 years before Seraphina had quietly begun correcting it. But tonight he read carefully. He asked question-specific, operational questions that told her he was processing the full structure of what he was signing rather than simply moving paper. At 3:20 in the morning, Ferris came into the room from the corridor. He had cleaned the blood from his face at some point in the last 2 hours. Cut above his ear had dried in a dark line that made him look like a man who had been in a fight and not the kind who had come out the other side unambiguously victorious. "Vivienne," he said. Seraphina looked up. "She's gone," Ferris said. "Left the estate sometime between midnight and 1. Car service. Paid in cash. We think through a pre-arranged account. She didn't take much, just what she could carry." He paused. She knew the night was over before it finished. Seraphina nodded. She had expected this. Vivienne Cross was not stupid, and stupid people didn't run in organized ways. Vivienne had a prepared exit because she had been operating inside a structure that required prepared exits. Question of where she had gone and what she carried with her was a question for morning, when there were resources to direct at it properly. "Let her go for tonight," Seraphina said. Dante looked up from the document in front of him. "She'll surface," Seraphina said. "And when she does, the documentation on the drive is enough to isolate her legally and organizationally. She has nowhere to go that doesn't eventually bring her back into the frame." She picked up her pen. "Tonight we finish what we're doing here." Ferris went back to the corridor. At 4:45, Voss gathered his papers and his associates and said, with the precise understatement of a lawyer who charged enough per hour to have earned the right to it, "Think that's as tight as we can make it tonight." He looked at Seraphina. "You should sleep soon," she said. He left. Dante looked across the empty table at his wife. The documents were signed and filed, and the building was quiet. And outside the windows, the sky had begun the subtle shift from black to the deep pre-dawn gray. That means night is over, whether you're ready for it or not. "The estate needs to be cleared," Seraphina said. "The device in the study, and anything else Cassian's people installed during the security upgrade. That needs to be done by someone who reports to Ferris directly, not through the standard security chain." "I'll handle it," Dante said. "The Harrison terminal situation Pell needs to be approached by someone who understands she was recruited through financial pressure, not loyalty. She'll cooperate if she understands the alternative clearly." "I know how to approach people, Seraphina." "I know you do," she said. Not apologetic, adjusting. She had been operating in a mode of pure operational output for the last 6 hours, and the mode had its own momentum. She set the pen down and pressed both hands flat on the table and looked at him. "I know you do." The room was very quiet. "The council reconvenes at 9, she said. "You should be there." "You should be there," he said. She looked at him. "With me," he said. "As not in the way it's been." He stopped. He was not good at this. He had spent his adult life in a family structure and an organization where precision of feeling was a liability, and that cost him now, visibly, when precision of feeling was the only tool that would work. "I mean that I want you there as what you actually are, not as my wife in the way people think that means." He looked at the table. "As what you've been the whole time." She looked at his face genuinely, looked the way she used to, the way she had started doing again tonight in the spaces between everything else. He was 43 years old and tired, in a way that wasn't just tonight's tired, and she understood that what he was trying to say was not an apology. Exactly. Because an apology implies the speaker believes the words cover the damage. He was not that naive anymore. He was asking her to let him stand beside her while she did the work he had spent 9 years failing to see. All right, she said. It was not forgiveness. It was a decision. Difference mattered. She went into labor at 6:12 in the morning. Not dramatically, there was no drama left in her. She had used it all. She had run the entire inventory of drama available to a human being across one night and come out the other side into something that felt like bedrock. Just a contraction, deep and certain, that told her with the absolute authority of a body that has been trying to communicate something for weeks that the conversation was now going to happen on its own timeline, regardless of hers. She looked at the window. Dawn had fully arrived, pale, November thin, the kind of light that doesn't warm anything, but at least makes it possible to see. Dante, she said. He had been standing by the window with a coffee that Ferris had produced from somewhere an hour ago, mostly untouched. He turned. She looked at him. He understood immediately. In 9 years, he had not always understood her, but he understood this. Ferris, he said, loud, toward the corridor. The hospital was 20 minutes away, and Ferris drove it in 14, and Seraphina spent those 14 minutes focused on the specific internal work of a body that has decided to do something enormous and requires full cooperation and allows no negotiation. She did not speak. She breathed. She held the armrest with one hand and kept the other pressed against her side, and she thought, between contractions, about the sequence she had burned in the study, step 1 through step 7, and she went through it in her head to confirm that everything had been executed, that there were no open threads, that the house was as sound as she could make it. 3 steps remained: morning council, estate clearance, Vivienne. All 3 could be handled without her for the next several hours. She had built a structure that did not require her physical presence to function. That had been, she understood now, the point of the whole thing, not to make herself indispensable, but to make the structure sound enough that it could hold, while she was somewhere else, doing something that had nothing to do with ledgers or succession bylaws or listening devices behind curtain brackets. The hospital entrance appeared. The baby arrived at 9:41 in the morning. A girl, 7 pounds, 2 ounces, with dark hair and eyes that were the unfocused deep blue of all newborns, and a cry that was nothing like fragile. It was the full-throated assertion of something that had been waiting for exactly this moment and was not going to be quiet about it. Seraphina held her and looked at her face, and felt, moving through her like weather, the accumulated weight of the past 9 years. Not lifting, not resolving, just moving through, the way grief moves through when you finally give it room. Acknowledging itself and continuing. Dante was beside the bed. He had been there through the labor, in the specific way of a man who understands. He has no useful function and remains anyway, which was its own kind of statement. He had not left the room. He had not checked his phone in the last 40 minutes, which was, she understood, a significant act for a man who had spent his adult life treating every silence as a communications problem. He looked at the baby, his daughter. His face did something she had no word for and decided she didn't need one. She looks like you, he said. She looks like herself, Seraphina said. She's been doing that since before she was born. He made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was adjacent to one, the sound of a man, surprised by something he hadn't prepared himself to feel. Seraphina looked down at the baby's face. Small, absolute, requiring everything and apologizing for none of it. What do we call her? Dante said. Seraphina had thought about this for 4 months. She had a name she had been carrying since the 4th month, when she had known, with enough certainty, to begin committing to things. She had not told Dante, not because she was keeping it from him, but because the moment had needed to be the right one. Marin, she said. Marin Veyron, he repeated it quietly. testing the weight of it. "All right," he said. The same words she had used in the Harrison building, with the same quality, not simple agreement, but the acknowledgement of a decision that has been made by the right person. Ferris held the council at 9 that morning without either of them, which was the correct call, which Seraphina had authorized her before she went into labor. He presented the documentation. He presented the ledger. He presented the certified succession papers and the legal structure Voss had finalized at 4:45. Raymond voted with the family. Dresch voted with the family. Holst, who had been calculating odds since the Caro Club, and had arrived by morning at the conclusion that his odds were better with the documented truth than with a version of events that was now thoroughly exposed, voted with the family. Price abstained, which was not a vote for anything, and was not nothing. Cassian's formal removal from the Veyron organization was ratified by 4-0, with one abstention, at 9:22 in the morning. The motion also formally recognized Seraphina Veyron's role as co-head of the restructured family leadership, pending her return from the hospital, which Ferris announced with the specific deadpan of a man who has seen a great deal, and I stopped being surprised by any of it. Council adjourned. Ferris texted her 2 words. "It's done." She read it in the hospital room, with Marin asleep against her chest, and Dante sitting in the chair beside the bed, with his elbows on his knees, and his face resting in his hands, not distressed. She could tell the difference. Just a man finally stopping after a very long run, and letting his body announce what it had been doing. She put the phone face down on the blanket. Vivienne surfaced 11 days later, not in Chicago, in a city considerably farther away, through a contact that Seraphina's network identified without drama and reported to her in the same tone as everything else. Precisely, with documentation, without editorialism. Vivienne had reached out to a former Moretti associate through a communications channel that had been under passive observation for 6 months. The message she sent established that she was looking for a position, that she had information she was willing to trade, and that she was no longer affiliated with the Veyron organization. Seraphina read the report sitting at the desk in the renovated East Wing study, where the curtain bracket had been cleaned out and the wall behind it had been replastered and painted the same color as before. Marin was 11 days old and asleep in the adjacent room under the supervision of a woman named Clara, who had been hired for competence rather than recommendation and was working out precisely as expected. She read the report twice. She thought about Vivienne Cross, 31 years old, trapped inside a plan she had not fully understood, used by a man who had identified her very specific hungers and calibrated his approach to them with the precision of a long-term strategist. She thought about the recording she had held for 11 months. She thought about what it would do, deployed into the right channels, to the Moretti connection. Vivienne was currently attempting to activate. She picked up her pen. She wrote a brief, specific instruction to the contact who had produced the report. 7 sentences, clinical, the kind of document that, handed to the right legal structure, would close every door Vivienne was currently attempting to open, and would do so through means that were not violent and were not reversible. She did not want Vivienne destroyed. She wanted Vivienne contained in the specific permanent way that meant the ongoing energy required to monitor her would eventually approach 0. She sealed the instruction. She set it aside. She looked at the study around her, the desk, the shelves, the replastered wall, the window through which November had deepened into December's, and the grounds had gone from stripped to frozen. The room looked almost exactly as it had, different in the ways you had to know to look for. She thought about Cassian. He was in a legal arrangement, that Voss was managing a structure that kept him contained without producing the kind of public exposure that would damage the family's legitimate operations. It was not a light arrangement. It was not comfortable. Built to hold, and it would hold. She had been precise about that. She had been asked by Dante in a quiet moment 3 days after Marin's birth, whether she wanted Cassian removed more permanently. He had not said it that way. He had said, "What do you want done with him?" And the emphasis on "you" was a kind of reckoning and acknowledgement that she was the one who had built the case, who had documented the damage, who had the clearest view of the full shape of what Cassian had done and what he had intended. She had looked at her husband and said, "Contained, permanent and contained." And then she had said, "That's the last time I want to be asked about this." He had not asked again. Dante came to the study at 4 in the afternoon on the 12th day. He knocked. She noticed, and did not make a point of noticing, and said, "Come in." He came in. He was carrying something, a small velvet case, dark green, the kind of case that had been in the Veyron family since before either of them. He set it on the desk between them. She looked at it. "I don't want it back," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm not asking you to take it back, I just—" He stopped. He sat down in the chair across the desk, the chair where Vivienne had once sat, months ago, telling her she wasn't her enemy. He sat in it like a man who intends to stay. "I wanted you to be the one to decide what happens to it." Seraphina looked at the velvet case for a long moment. She reached out and opened it. The crown of Veyron sat in its fitted interior, emerald and gold, old and heavy, and exactly what it had always been, a symbol created by men who needed something visible to mark the authority they could not fully articulate. Beautiful in the way that things built to signify power are beautiful, completely inadequate to actually represent what power is. Closed the case. She stood, carried it to the far bookshelf, and placed it behind the front row of books, present, accessible, neither displayed nor discarded. She turned around. "The council meeting on Thursday," she said, sitting back down. "The Harrington account restructure needs to come before the Harrison terminal audit, or the numbers will conflict at the filing level. I've noted the order in the briefing document." Dante looked at her. Then he looked at where she had placed the case. Then he looked back at her. "All right," he said. She picked up her pen. He stayed in the chair, which was new in 9 years. Dante had never stayed in any room where work was being done without either participating or leaving. He stayed and he was quiet, and after a while he said, without apparent agenda, "She's been asleep for 3 hours. Clara will bring her when she wakes," Seraphina said. "I know." He was quiet again. "I just thought you'd want to know." She looked up from the document she was reviewing. He was looking at the window, the winter light on his face, tired in the way that had become his baseline. These weeks, not the emergency tired of the night at the Caro Club, but the deep ordinary tired of a man who has stopped running and discovered that standing still requires its own kind of effort. "Thank you," she said. He nodded, still looking at the window. She went back to the document. The room was quiet in the way that rooms become quiet when the people inside them have stopped performing for each other, not comfortable exactly, not resolved, but real. The specific realness of two people who have been through something that cannot be undone and have decided, separately and then together, to remain in the same space and see what can be built in the aftermath. In January, Seraphina walked into the renovated Veyron ballroom for the first time since the estate had been cleared and reconstructed. The ballroom had been the site of the crowns ceremony, the rain on the black marble steps, the velvet case, the room that had frozen when Dante turned away from her. The room had been repainted, different light fixtures, the same proportions, but emptied of the specific atmosphere of that night, the way a room can be emptied of a night while retaining its walls. She walked to the far end. There was a glass case on the wall, new, installed during the renovation at her instruction. Inside it, on a fitted cushion, the crown of Veyron, not hidden anymore, not in a drawer, not behind books, on display, behind glass, the way you display something you are not ashamed of and do not intend to use. She stood in front of it for a moment. Marin was in her arms, 6 weeks old now, awake and looking at the room with the unfocused, serious attention of a child who has not yet decided what deserves her focus, and is therefore applying it to everything. She would not remember this room. She would not remember this moment. But she was here for it, which was the thing that mattered. Dante came to stand beside her. He looked at the crown in the case. She watched him look at it, watched him understand, in the way that understanding arrives slowly and then completely, that the crown had never been what he thought it was, that the night he placed it on Vivienne's head, he had not given power to the wrong woman. He had simply revealed, with a gesture intended to diminish, exactly where the power had always been, in the woman who had spent 9 years building a second structure inside the first, who had moved the fortune before anyone knew to look for it, who had found the device and left it in place, who had walked into the Caro Club at 12:43 in the morning with a hard drive and a newborn in her body and 3 months of documented evidence, and had said, without performance, without trembling, "Would you like to begin with the Moretti payments?" The woman who had never needed the crown. "She's looking at the light," Dante said. He meant Marin, the winter light, coming through the ballroom's tall windows, which Marin had found and was tracking with the focused intensity of someone encountering something for the first time and finding it worth the attention. "She does that," Seraphina said. They stood together in the renovated ballroom, and the crown sat behind glass where it would remain, and the light came through the windows, and Marin watched it with absolute concentration, and the house around them was as sound as Seraphina had known how to make it. Not perfect. Nothing she built was perfect. She had never made the mistake of building for perfection. She had built for endurance, and the house endured,